Welcome back to the second part of this poker chip cabinet build. Where we had left off, I had the main part of the carcass together and all the pieces ready to assemble. Now I have a confession to make. This is my first time actually doing drawer slides. I've seen some videos where people actually put the drawer slides on the carcass of the cabinet first and then onto the drawers themselves. I chose to do it this way because of how I'm stacking the tray brackets. I felt that this would go a lot easier. So once I finished one side, I flipped it over and did the other side. I mean, who would have thought? I guess you have to have 2 brackets per drawer, one on each side. Makes sense. So I then repeated this step 6 more times for these poker chip tray drawers. Then it was time to take these drawer slides over to the carcass. I measured down how far each of these drawer slides needed to be and started screwing them in. As you can see here, I'm filming from the rear of this cabinet, meaning I have no back to this cabinet yet, and it made installing these drawer slides a whole lot easier. Ooh, look. Out, in. They actually work. I must have done something right. 3 drawers down and only 5 to go. Let's get busy. Now, as I'm doing these drawer slides, you may see that I don't screw it all the way in with my handheld driver, and I use a screwdriver just to finish it up. That's so that the screw doesn't pop through the other side. If I tightened it down too tight, it would have popped through. As you can see, as I'm putting this drawer in, this is the bracket that I'm calling for the poker chip tray. And as you can see, it's not solid, and I designed that so it helps cut down both on the weight of the cabinet but also the cost of the cabinet, because wood, it's a little pricey these days. Now I'm installing the very bottom of the cabinet. I wasn't sure exactly where I wanted this, so I waited towards the end of putting in the drawers just to make sure I knew exactly where I wanted this. Now I've got to take a second and just say how much I love these floor mats. It's those puzzle piece floor mats, so comfortable laying on the floor if you have to, or kneeling, and it also helps your back as you're standing and working on your projects. If you don't have any, get some for your shop. And who doesn't like a nice confined space shot in a video? Is anybody getting claustrophobic yet? Then it was time to start ripping down some pieces of plywood for the last drawer, the very bottom drawer. Then, of course, it was over to the miter saw to start cutting all the stuff down to the final size lengthwise. And like I normally do, I will just keep checking my marks and sneak up on my line. Like the first drawer that I did, the actual drawer box, I added a 1/4 inch groove on the bottom, or in some cases they call it a dado, just to hold in the bottom of that drawer. Just like the first drawer that I did, I just did simple rabbet joints in the corners just to glue everything up, and then it was time to assemble everything and get it ready to install into the cabinet. Then it was time to measure and figure out where the center of these drawers were for these handles. It's always a good rule of thumb to center your drawer handles. Now I had made up this little jig so that I can kind of know exactly where I was going to drill the holes. So once I had the jig all glued up, I then drew a reference line long ways on this jig. Then once I had my line long ways, I then took my ruler, found where the center of the handle was going to be, and then where I wanted my holes for the screws to be. I marked one drawer where the center was, and then I grabbed my long ruler and I copied that mark all the way up on all the drawers, so I knew where to line up my jig. And here's a nice close-up shot of that center mark on all of the drawers, and I did it at the bottom because that's where that jig will match up. Now this is a lengthy clip, but I wanted to put it in here just to show you that we woodworkers do make mistakes. As you watch this clip, you'll see that I kind of start to look at where my holes are in reference to the actual drawer front, and my holes were actually a little on the upper side of the drawer face. So basically what that means is the reference holes that I had drilled in my template were not in the center of the drawer face. So the handle would have actually been towards the top of the drawer face and not in the middle. That's why it's always good to be checking yourself twice before you make any cuts or drill any holes into your project. You don't want to accidentally cut or drill into the wrong place, because then you've got to start all over or recut a piece, and that adds in time and extra expenses you don't want to have to deal with. So I grabbed my ruler, I started doing some measurements, figuring out where I needed the new holes to be drilled, re-drilled the holes, and then it was time to actually start drilling the holes inside these drawer faces. Now that I have my mistake fixed, we can actually get to putting some holes in these drawer faces. If you remember that mark I put at the very bottom of the drawer, that lines up with a center mark I have on this template, and that will line everything up on every drawer so that I know that the handles are perfectly centered. As you can see here, I also use a clamp to hold my template in place, but I also put a scrap 2x4 behind where I'm drilling. This will help prevent blowout from the back side of the drawer face. Once you get a rhythm going, you can get this done in no time. Or maybe it's because I sped the video up. Now it was time to make the front bottom piece of this cabinet. So I made some lines on this piece of wood and drew out some little squiggly lines so it made it look like I knew what I was doing. But in all honesty, I did have some idea of what I was going to do. Now the Sharpie on the wood is a trick that I picked up from other woodworkers. You'll cut up to the Sharpie line and then you'll sand the rest of the Sharpie off with a sander, and that'll get you your final dimension. I didn't notice this until I went back and watched the video, but I got a creeper looking in my window right about now. That was totally weird. You gotta love having kids around. Now if you remember that Sharpie mark, all I'm doing here is sanding all that Sharpie mark away, and that'll give me my final dimension and a smooth finish. Now I have my bench sander at 80 grit, which is very aggressive. So then I took it over and I used the orbital sander with 120 and then a 220 sandpaper to finish it up. The cabinet was coming along, but there's still one big problem with it. There's a giant hole in the top. So it was time to break back out this ambrosia maple that I was using to do the corner pieces of the cabinet. After I had straightened up the edge with my Festool track saw, I brought it over here to the miter saw and was cutting it down to the lengths. Then it was over to the trusty table saw to start ripping down these pieces. I was going to end up having 3 pieces in all to get the total width of the cabinet from front to back. Now if you watch closely, you see me continue to grab the tape measure and kind of look over the piece of wood and measure. There were some grain patterns on this ambrosia that I really liked, and I wanted to make sure that I cut in between those grain patterns so that way it would look beautiful. If you watch my blade, you can see it cut right through the middle of those grains. The next day, I believe it was quite cold that morning, so I opted to do some inside work while the shop was getting up to temperature so that I could glue up the top. So here's some video of me putting the clear coat on the drawer face of the poker chip tray drawers. Now these drawer faces are permanently attached to the chip drawers. So the easiest way I found to do this was to actually clamp the chip drawers to the edge of this table all the way around, and then I could just continue doing each of the drawer faces without having to stop and wait for it to dry. Pretty smart. Bet you didn't think of it. Or maybe you did. Enough putting clear coat on. Let's start gluing up this top. Now I kind of would play around with the top pieces to figure out how I wanted it to look, and I came up with this design. Then I tightened down the clamps, not to squeeze too much glue out, but to get a good tight bond as the glue dried. You also want to make sure you use enough clamps to get a good even clamping pressure across your glue surface. Now I don't see too many woodworkers talking about this in many other videos, but I do try to think of safety when it comes to my projects. So here I'm adding in a hole in the back of the cabinet so that it can be attached to the wall. Being that it is a little bit of a taller cabinet, I just didn't want it to have the tendency to tip over on children. At this point, I can finally see the end of this project. The customer went with a red oak stain, which I think added a lot of character to this cabinet. Because I didn't want stain on the inside of the cabinet, I had to do a lot of fine brushwork in the front. But then I could go back to my normal wipe-on method that I usually do with my stains. Hold up, wait a minute, what do we got going on here? The stain coming off instead of going on? What kind of craziness is this? Alright, there we go. Now we're going in the right direction. I'm going to have a talk with my editing department or something. So as I finish up staining the cabinet itself, the top is now ready to be sanded down and prepped for its final stain and clear coat. Now I did have two options here. I could have ran it through the planer or hit it with the belt sander, and I chose the belt sander because it's pretty much flat. I just need to get the glue and kind of just hit a little high spots here and there. Then I used the orbital sander with a 120 grit sandpaper and finishing it off with a 220 to get that smooth finish. Then I grabbed my palm router and put a nice decorative edge on the top of this cabinet. I mean, who wants a boring top, right? How about a little wave to it? Now I only did 3 sides because the back of the top is going to be up against the wall. No need for a decorative edge. And like the cabinet itself, the top got the red oak stain applied to it as well. And I just did the same wipe on method. I find this a whole lot easier than getting out a sponge brush and worry about the brush leaving puddles on your workpiece. Then it was time to get some clear coat on all of the pieces of this project. The cabinet itself and the top all got several coats of the clear coat. Of course, I used my go-to, the Total Boat Halcyon clear varnish, which I always think ends up being beautiful. Now we couldn't just leave these chip trays wood. We needed a little something to protect those chips. So what better than some poker green felt? My wife graciously stepped in and helped out with this part of the build, because you definitely needed 4 hands for this, and boy was it sticky. Once we had cut down the felt to the size that we needed for each tray, we used a spray adhesive just to spray each of the grooves, and we made sure we coated it very, very well. And then I worked the felt down into the grooves as she kind of held it up, just so it wouldn't go ahead and stick to the wood until we were ready for it. Thanks for watching part 2 of the poker chip cabinet video. We thank you for following along as this cabinet came together. The customer was very pleased with how it turned out, and so were we. As always, please like and share our videos so other people can enjoy the beauty of these projects coming together. Also, now that we're on YouTube, make sure you subscribe so you can get the video notifications. And as always, we'll see you on the next video.